Hey friends, in today's video I thought I'd answer some of the questions that you have asked me in personal messages or over in comments. I'm seeing that there's a lot of misconception about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, or what's going on, or what is potentially to happen with this war. I think a lot of it is because there's been a constant drip of propaganda into the US channels from Russian broadcasts like Russia Today or whatever. So it's important to set those straight, and it will help us understand and have the correct initial positions and how to think about the relationship between the two countries and the war that's going on right now. So we're going to tackle three questions today. One is the Russian myth about Ukraine. So we're seeing that Moscow, for example, is positioning itself as sort of being the mother of all Russian cities, including Kiev. So that is false, and I'll tell you why. Question number two: what is the Ukrainian narrative? Like, why do we exist? How we think about ourselves? And number three is the big question. I've been asked this multiple times, which is if NATO closes the skies over Ukraine, isn't that going to lead to a nuclear war? Okay, so let's start with number one. So as we see, the Russian propaganda usually has two lines of attack on the history or on the image of Ukraine. Number one is that Ukraine has always been subservient or subdominant to Moscow. In his deranged speech, and then earlier last year, Putin wrote an essay that lays out his historical vision of Ukraine and Russia, and we see that there's some serious revisionist history going on. So historical is the line of attack, number one, and number two is that since 2014, Ukraine is being run by Nazis, neo-Nazis, and which is his justification for intruding in Ukraine right now to free Ukraine. So let's talk about the history of Russia and Ukraine and what's going on there. So, as you know, Kiev was founded in 5th century, in 482, after the birth of Christ. It had developed into its own little kingdom, and then later it had united the kingdoms that were around it and became a pretty large sovereign government, a sort of an empire of sorts. There have been Slavs, the people that I belong to, but also there were barbarians or Vikings, who Ukrainians call barbarians, who came in and also started being a large part through trade, through war, a large part of the history. The name of the empire was Kievan Rus, which means that it's the Russian lands belonging to Kiev, because it was able to unite them into a serious formidable force. So much so that Romans had to make pacts with Kievan Rus not to attack, and so some of the troops within Kievan Rus were on guard for that, would be eastern border of Roman Empire. The same thing happened down south with Byzantine Empire. We were trading. The Crimea Peninsula was one of the foreposts of Greek culture. So it was its own sovereign thing. Then in 1147, one of the rulers of Kiev went north and east and founded Moscow in 1147. So Moscow was there 500 years after Kiev was already a formidable force. So now by assumption, Putin would say, well, it has historically come to pass that Moscow is the mother of Russian cities, which is what you have to really do a lot of mental gymnastics to come to that conclusion. Moscow was never mother of anything. The reason that Moscow sort of became bigger and more politically strong, more militarily strong, bunch of reasons. I'll name two, which I think are the most dominant. Number one is that in the age of Mongol Empire, as you know, they started out as horse riding invaders moving west, and they were sacking everything on their way. So when it came to Moscow and Kievan Rus kept fighting. Kievan Rus kept resisting them and were constantly pummeled. Moscow, in its turn, did not fight. They gave up pretty easily. They said, all right, we will pay you tribute. This was Genghis Khan's son, who went all the way to Moscow and Kiev. They said, we give up. Here's tribute. You as our ruler of Mongol will have a say in who we choose to be our government and such and such. That's why Kiev and Rus was pummeled and was weakened, while Moscow was left alone, because they basically were subservient to the Mongol emperor. And then after Mongol Empire kind of fell apart, then Moscow was able to be relatively independent. So that's why it grew. Another big event I think that helped the domination of Moscow in the later years was that the Orthodoxy played a big role in history of that entire region. And at some point, the patriarch of the Orthodox Church moved their headquarters from Kiev to Moscow. So to come to a conclusion that an empire that was there 400 to 500 years before Moscow is somehow now the little brother to Moscow, that's completely false. There's nothing behind that sentence. And in that essay that Putin wrote, you see that he sort of makes that assumption and then goes from there. He just says, well, that's how it is. There's no justification. No, he's not trying to do anything. He just says, well, Moscow was there first, and then he goes on to the wars between Russia and Swedes, and so that piece of propaganda is completely false. Kiev was there first. Kiev did have a sovereign state much sooner before Moscow, and then a ruler from Kiev founded Moscow. Okay, so. And then another interesting thing about this is that the word Russian was sort of appropriated by Russia because they called themselves Russia. It's sort of a trickery in words, but Ukrainians are considered Russians as well, meaning of the Rus lands. And Rus did start in Kiev. Rus was under Kiev for a very long time. So it's not true to say that Russia is where Russians live. Ukrainians are the originators and descendants from that people, from the Rus people. So if anything, Kiev should be the mother of Russian lands. But of course, we live in a modern world, and we don't have those idiotic ambitions. And then line of attack number 2 that Russian propaganda has is that Ukraine is now ruled by neo-Nazis. And I have to say this one is more oriented towards internal Russian market. This is not so much propagated in the West, but still you hear here and there that people would say, aren't you guys Nazis over there? In Germany, this is actually more prevalent. People tend to mention it. I'm in Germany right now, by the way. That's where my life has taken me thus far. So the myth goes that in 2013 and 2014 revolution, the rightful president Yanukovych was ousted, and it was a coup d'état, and now the neo-Nazi junta is running Ukraine. So as you know, what had already happened, the would-be dictator Yanukovych, he started to really tighten the screws on the freedoms in Ukraine, and then the trigger was the event when he went to Brussels to sign the association agreement with the European Union. At the last minute, he reneged, as we think, by the word of his friend or master Putin, and he said, no, we're not going to join the EU agreement. We're going to go with another union that Russia was setting up. So and that triggered the revolution. Then it kept getting worse because the would-be dictator Yanukovych started to really crack down and beating people up. But thankfully, Ukrainians held their ground, and Yanukovych left to Rostov, which is in Moscow. So by the legend of Putin, the next elections and everything Fourth is neo-Nazis. I will not even disprove this because this is blatantly idiotic. For those of you who have been in Ukraine, for those of you who know Ukrainians, you know this is total BS. One thing I'll sort of mention, because it sort of needs saying, that every country has nationalist parties, Ukrainian included, but on the last elections, the Nationalist Party got maybe a little over 1%. They're not holding any seats in parliament. They do not control any ministerial seats, no branches of power. So to say that anything remotely that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis is blatantly false. Putin is doing this because this is a nice narrative for his internal market, to scare his own people, to justify the war, to justify the losses they're currently incurring. But even that, I don't think is going to hold for too long. Okay, so question number 2 that I've been asked is, I've been talking a lot about the national narratives and how different peoples think about themselves. Russians, for example, they live in opposition to the West. They see themselves as being the preservers of morality and God's rule on earth. That's why they have this perverted system of the tsars and presidents as being the hand and the voice of God on earth. It is interesting, by the way, to come back to previous question, because the narrative of Russian people was not sort of a naturally occurring event. It was pretty artificial. So when Russia was moving from a state of different warring kingdoms into having one Tsar, they had to have some sort of a reason for people to serve the Tsar, instead of keeping to their own little kingdoms. And the way they did it was the Russian Tsar not having his own intelligentsia, inviting one of the professors from Kiev Academy to come up with a narrative, and that's how they came up with this idea that Russia is there as the holy nation, as having a special purpose in the world to prevent the world from falling apart morally and protect it from godlessness overtaking the earth. So that was completely made up. It was an artificial narrative, but a lot of people think, well, this is who we are now as Russians. I love American myth, and as I mentioned, myth does not mean lies. Myth is the underlying story of why we are and who we are. I love the American because the American is very clearly that we are the home of the brave and the land of the free. So America positions itself as the leader of the free world. And I think it's great as far as reason to be and motivation for what we do in the world. And we'll talk about that in the next question as well. So the question is, well, what is the Ukrainian myth? What is the Ukrainian narrative? And the question, and one thing that comes to mind right away is that Ukrainians are a free people. This has been a very strong message. In fact, if you look at Ukrainian national symbol, the trident, it actually spells out in Cyrillic the word voля, which means freedom. So we've been known, like starting Cossack times and then through revolutions in the beginning of the 20th century and then the recent ones, that Ukrainians do not tolerate oppression. So we will throw off any shackles of oppression when it becomes too unbearable or too bad. We have the capacity to unite and stand against and resist the oppression. One problem that Ukraine has, though, is that it's not very good. The people in Ukraine are not very good at building social institutions. And this is sort of a historical trauma that we have because Ukrainians have never trusted the government. On my recent episode, which is in Ukrainian of my podcast, I was talking to a historian about this, and he's saying that the problem was that throughout history, Ukrainian elites have always been entangled with other governments, other national projects. So, for example, when Poland was an empire, a huge state, a few hundred years ago, Ukrainian elites were trying to become Polish elite. When then later Lithuania became a superpower in our region, Ukrainian elites wanted to be part of that. So the people who were sort of blue collar, who were not who are not part of the elites, they felt like, well, the elites don't care about us. All they care about is their own well-being, and we're left alone to our own devices. So that had kept up until this day, that Ukrainians do not trust government. They view them as more of enemies who are there out to rob them through taxation, through different programs, through even laws. And not let them, as blue-collar people, reach a level of life they would like. So that is somewhat justified, and skepticism towards government is good in my mind, as being conservative. But it does hinder us from building strong social institutions, which, as we know from recent studies, is what really makes a country prosper. So that's something we have to work on. So I would say the Ukrainian raison d'être is still being worked on. And hopefully once this war is over, we will all see the development of it. And I'm really looking forward to being part of building it as well. Okay, and then finally, the huge question is that everybody's talking about today is, if NATO closes skies over Ukraine, isn't that going to lead to a nuclear war? Okay, so I'll tell you this. Zelensky, in his speeches, he's saying, well, that's something that Russia hadn't brought up. That's something that the West sort of uses as their own reason. And it has a weird effect of self-fulfilling prophecy, because when Putin sees that you guys are using this as your own reason, he says, oh, yeah, I'm going to do that. Don't meddle with Ukraine, because I'm going to do what you're afraid of. So you could say, well, this is a valid argument or not, because on February 28th, the fourth day of war, we saw that Putin was putting on high alert all his long-range nuclear weapons. And what's funny about that is that the weapons that he was putting on high alert, they were specifically long-range. So he was not threatening Ukraine, he was threatening the West. But my message about that, and my thought about that, is that whether we realize it or not, but that threat has already happened. That's going to happen whatever happens, whatever future is of Ukraine. So if you think, as a Westerner, that, well, if we back down now and don't get involved in Ukraine, then Putin's not going to launch nukes at us, or he's not going to threaten us with nukes. Well, big fucking mistake, because he knows that this is the only weapon he has. He knows this is the only leverage he has, and he's going to use it until he gets everything he wants. And we already talked about the Russian mode of thinking. They think they deserve everything. Putin himself, his deputies of parliament, recently a priest sort of let it slip in one of his sermons. There's a video of him circulating that they consider Russian lands everything beyond Ukraine to Kaliningrad, which goes up to English Channel. So they think that's all their land. NATO knows this, so that's why NATO is building up their troops on the western border of Ukraine. So yes, there is most likely a danger of nuclear war, but it doesn't mean that if you leave Ukraine alone, there's not going to be this threat. This threat is always going to be there. That nukes are always going to be on the table. So if Ukraine falls, Putin's going to go into Baltic countries, and until he reaches that point, and then he'll reevaluate once he reaches there, because if it was all too easy, threatening nukes and West backing down, maybe he will go in even further. These people do not have any checks and balances. They will do everything they can to get all they want. So it's not a good reasoning to say, if we back down now, nuclear threat is not going to be a thing. It's always going to be a thing as long as Putin wants something. Number two, Ukraine has really shown that Russian army is not as strong as it has the reputation. I think their propaganda is much stronger than their army. If you look at the channels where our army, our soldiers, our intelligence are leaking their videos, they're taking there's some videos of interrogations of the people of the Russian army we captured. They're not strong seasoned warriors. They're kids. Like a lot of them are like 20 years old. They don't know what they're doing. They're crying, calling their mom, bail me out. I don't know what I'm doing in Ukraine. So the lie that this is the second strongest army, one of the strongest armies in the world, had been broken. They're not that strong. So make your own conclusions from that. Another thought that I have about the nuclear threat is that, a little bit gauche, but hear me out. Let's say you go down street in Woodbury, Minnesota, and you see a homeless guy raping a girl, and you're thinking to yourself, well, should I get involved? And then at that moment you notice that he's openly carrying a gun, and you're saying, well, right now it's a controllable rape situation, but if I get involved, this could be a life and death situation, and there's people around me. He might start shooting at everybody. I might not get in, it might be rational for me not to get involved. And my question to you is that a situation that you accept? I don't think that anybody would accept that situation. So, and you might say, of course, this will never happen in Woodbury. This is more of a Seattle thing, and I would agree with you, but the concept still stands. So if you let Putin intimidate you into stepping back from Ukraine, not helping Ukraine, even though it's clear as day what's happening, the invasion and the attempt at oppression of Ukrainian people, if you let Putin intimidate you, that's gonna intensify in the future. He will see that you're afraid, and he will use it to push and push and push. This is not a rational person. This is not a person with whom you can negotiate for anything close to reason. And then final thought I have about this is what kind of reputation does the United States want in the future? This is now the time to where your reputation is on the line. We talked about the narrative that America lives in. This is you're the frontier for freedom. You're the leaders of the free world, but that also comes with some responsibility. Are you actually leaders of the world? Are you going to stand for freedom in the world, or are you going to kowtow to a crazy ape with a nuclear device? Let's go back to 1994, when three countries, the United States, France, Great Britain, and Russia, signed the Budapest Memorandum, which said, if Ukraine gives up nukes, we will protect, or we will see to the integrity of Ukrainian borders. Now is the time to pay up, and now is the time to implement your promises. Are you gonna step in to keep the integrity of Ukrainian borders or not? Listen, the question here is, despite what might happen, what is your word worth? And how is it going to be reflected in the future? Can we rely on America? Is there that gravitas? Is there that reputation that America currently has? The soft power, the power to persuade, the power to negotiate, and the power to influence the world. That's going to go away if you don't follow up on your promises. Just a hypothetical situation. Let's say that somehow we get Iran to the negotiating table again, and we say, well, Iran, we don't really trust you with your nuclear program, and we need you to disarm, but we're going to promise nothing's going to happen to you. We promise that if there's any threat in the future, we will be there to help you out. Is Iran going to believe you? This is just one of the potential scenarios. But I don't think, especially Americans, you realize how much soft power you have. There's the hard power. This is the military, but soft power is the power to influence and persuade. And if this goes through, your reputation is going to take a huge hit. So the question is, I understand there is your instinct of self-preservation, but it's ill-advised because number one, as we said, the threat is not going to go away. The threat is always going to be there if you show that you're afraid of it. Number two, the reputation that you currently have and the benefits that come with that are going to go away in the future. So that's what's leveraging right now. That's what's happening with that question. So is there a nuclear threat? Most likely yes, but you're already under threat. It's not going away. So the question is, what do you do with it now? All right, friends, I thank you for your attention, for your questions. I'd love to answer more. If you have more, message me, ask questions in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer, and I hope for a soon victory of Ukraine over Russia. Slava Ukraini.